Okay, welcome back to the channel, and in today's video I'm talking about how Kanye West and Balenciaga have essentially saved Gap and might save Gap in the long-term future. But before I continue, if you want to know how to learn about fashion more effectively, I've written an ebook on that, and the description to my ebook is in the description below. I definitely recommend it to everyone watching. So Gap was founded by Doris and Don Fisher in San Francisco in 1969. And the main motivation of why Don Fisher even started Gap in the first place was because he couldn't find a pair of jeans that fit him correctly. And there's actually a deeper story to this. So Don Fisher was friends with someone called Walter Haas Jr., who at the time was the president of Levi's, right? And the really interesting part of this story is the fact that Don couldn't necessarily not find his correct size of jeans because Levi's didn't make it. It was more because at department stores like Macy's and stuff, the way the denim was arranged was a bit of a mess and things weren't very considered in very big department stores. And so the experience of finding his denim would be hard. And then something else he also noticed was that Macy's didn't have a good size run a lot of the time in a lot of the stores that he would go to. So he came up with the idea to create, obviously, his store, The Gap, which would stock Levi's in a very specific way. He stocked a full-size run, and in the deal, there was sort of this agreement that he would always be sent the right sizes of Levi's from the company. And so that's how The Gap started. It was a very small store in San Francisco, the first store, and they were selling just Levi's denim and music records, which is interesting because they wanted to attract a younger demographic. And that also goes into the name, The Gap. The Gap was a reference to the generational gap between Don Fisher himself and his target audience of young adults and teens that he wanted to, bring to his store. And this business model was so successful, people then started to realize, oh, there's this place called The Gap where you can buy music records, the music in the store is kind of cool, and you can find the right Levi's denim, and you can find denim in the right size, and it's arranged really nicely and all that sort of stuff. And so it was really successful, and over the years, more stores would be opening across the US. What then later happened was Gap started creating their own apparel and would start putting their apparel in select stores alongside the Levi denim. And I think it was in 1991, that's when they stopped selling Levi's in their stores and it was exclusively, Gap apparel. But in between there, part of also what made Gap so successful was Gap obviously became Gap Incorporated, which is the bigger company, and they started to acquire brands like Old Navy and Banana Republic, which were also really successful. So you had the success of Gap itself, then you had the success of Old Navy and Banana Republic, and all of these things adding together to increase the success of Gap, and it expanded worldwide. And I would say when I think of the peak of Gap was definitely in the 90s and 2000s. I mean, obviously 90s was before my time, but I definitely remember the 2000s, like the insane commercials with all these different celebrities. And even there are so many commercials that people remember. There's that commercial with Missy Elliott. There's the commercial with Sarah Jessica Parker. There's also the really infamous commercial with LL Cool J, where he promoted Fubu, which for guys that don't know is like a really popular streetwear brand, really influential. For Us, By Us is what it stands for. And he made this sort of Gap rap in this commercial. And in between the commercial, he was like, For Us, By Us. And he was wearing a Fubu hat, I think, as well in the commercial. And Gap, because they didn't really know anything about streetwear at the time, they're just like, yeah, we don't know that brand, you can wear it in the commercial. And they didn't realize that he hijacked the Gap commercial to make kind of like an advertising campaign for Fubu, which was hilarious because eventually that made Gap more popular because a lot of people thought they could find Fubu in the Gap and loads of people would go to Gap. So their commercials and the marketing was insanely good. Like, that was a big reason why, especially in the 90s and the 2000s, Gap was big. And also, when you think of what people go to Gap for, people went to Gap for elevated basics. You could find, really simple hoodies, t-shirts, and especially denim, which was what it started with the Levi denim. that was what Gap was known for, and it was really high quality for the price they were charging. So it wasn't like the cheapest of all the brands, but it wasn't like super expensive, and it was well priced at the time. But eventually the success of Gap started to slow down, and there's so many reasons for this that I could go into. But the biggest reasons were, one, the fact that social media became a thing, and Gap didn't really advance with the social media times and marketing in a social media age. They also didn't really get on top of e-commerce quick enough. And then there was obviously loads of competitors that came in and underpriced them. So you had people like H&M, you know, all these brands, H&M, Zara, all these brands that came and sort of were offering an affordable price point, but also trendy things. And then it made Gap look expensive because they were basically undercutting the prices and selling things at a cheaper price. And a bigger reason, I think personally, is the fact that Gap didn't really evolve. And so when I think of fashion in the 90s and the 2000s, when fashion was really popular, and a YouTuber I really like, Tuba Avalon, I'll leave a link to a video she made about Gap in the description below. Definitely watch it. And a point she made that making this video I was going to make anyway was the fact that a lot of the brands that were big in the 90s had this minimalist aesthetic, you know, like the Jill Sanders and the Helmut Langs. And most times what happens in high fashion always trickles down to like the everyday person. So the everyday person might like what they're seeing Jill Sanders doing and Helmut Lang, but they can't afford it. But what they could afford was the Gap. So they would buy Gap clothing, and it was actually trendy to dress in a very minimal way. But then as the trends changed and Gap sort of didn't change, Gap had its own aesthetic, which I actually don't hate that. I like that some brands stay true to themselves. I'm just saying from a business perspective, sometimes you can see how that can mean that your sales will have like peaks and valleys based on where the trends are going. And you have their competitors that are undercutting them, like Zara and H&M, that literally follow every single trend to the letter and go on WGSN and look at all the trend forecasts and follow the trends. So that's kind of how they pushed Gap, not completely out of business, but took a huge amount of the market share that they did have before. And this is how the profits of Gap started plummeting and plummeting and plummeting. And that brings us to the current day, where Kanye West, of course, it was announced in 2020 that he had signed a 10-year deal with Gap. And I know when Kanye West signed this deal, a lot of people were confused, but I thought it made so much sense, because Kanye West is someone that, of course, has made over like $1 billion revenue with his collaboration, his Yeezy line at Adidas. Everyone knows that. It's one of the reasons why he's now a billionaire. He also has his Yeezy season collections that he does. He has his own, obviously, Yeezy brand that has, you know, big, elaborate fashion shows. And so he has shown that he can generate revenue from a mass market with a mass market brand like Adidas. He can work alongside a big company. He's involved in luxury a lot. You've seen on the Donda tour, like he's working with Demna Gvasalia a lot. And also there's the history. Kanye West worked part-time when he was a teenager at a Gap store in Chicago. So all these things sort of add together, and of course they need something to help their company. The company is dying. Loads of the stores have closed. You can barely find any stores. No one really talks about Gap anymore. You don't see any marketing campaigns. Like literally, the people watching this video, when was the last time you saw a Gap campaign that doesn't have anything to do with Yeezy Gap? It's rare. And so they just needed someone to bring back the cool factor of, you know, the Y2K of the 2000s, the minimalism of the 90s, and bring that cool and wow factor back to Gap. And that is exactly what Kanye West is bringing to Gap. I remember when he announced the 10-year deal, they were saying that they're hoping that he can reach a point where they're making like $1 billion in revenue, which we'll see if that happens. But I do believe that eventually they're going to reach those high numbers. And you can imagine with Gap's business plummeting, COVID did not help that at all. Especially when around the time that they announced this deal with Kanye West, they were dealing with all the COVID issues that all the other companies were dealing with. You can't open your stores, there's a lot of money you can't make. Even though you could ship things and people could buy stuff online, there were certain countries like China where a lot of the times non-essentials. You weren't allowed to just order non-essentials. So there was so many different factors. And I remember Moalola Ogunlesi, the fashion designer, she was announced as the head of design of Yeezy Gap. And she didn't really do much because of the pandemic and all that stuff that happened. And she didn't renew her contract after it ended past the year. So that was gone. But in my opinion, what made the Yeezy Gap thing really pick up steam and make me start to think, okay, this is actually something feasible, this is going to be a thing, is when Balenciaga were brought on board. And I'll explain the Balenciaga story, kind of how they came on board, but it's really to do with Kanye West's relationship with Demna Gvasalia. Now, for people that don't know, Demna Gvasalia is the current creative director of Balenciaga. He's also the co-founder with Guram, his brother, of Vetements, the brand Vetements. And Kanye West likes Demna's work. He made Demna one of the designers for Yeezy Season 1, so they worked together with that. Of course, as I mentioned before, they've collaborated on like the Donda tour that Kanye West was doing. They've collaborated on different apparel things, different merch things. So at this point, Kanye West and Demna Gvasalia have a really good working relationship. And going back to the Gap and why there were so many issues, before Balenciaga was brought on board, they only released 2 products, which is insane in all of that time. And the first product, I think, which was the round jacket, that wasn't released until like almost a year after the collaboration between Kanye West and Gap was announced. And then the second products were those cotton hoodies that came in different colors, and they also came in like kid sizes. So yeah, when it comes to fashion, Kanye West is used to working in a very sophisticated environment. Adidas is an extremely sophisticated brand. I know people think it's just a sportswear brand, but like the product testing that they do, like they hire engineers to work on the product testing. It's not like H&M and fast fashion brands. Sportswear is like a completely different thing. So the resources that Adidas has, very sophisticated. And Kanye West, think about the stuff that he's used to doing with like his own Yeezy season, or working with Demna, or, you know, working in the Adidas innovation labs and all those sort of things. So compare it to the Gap. And one thing that there's this amazing New York Times article, and a lot of the stuff that I will say is stuff that I learned from the New York Times article. So I'll definitely leave it below, definitely read it. But one of the things that they mentioned in this New York Times article is the fact that Kanye West was costing Gap a lot of money because he's sort of a perfectionist in a way, and he would take forever to make samples. He would just make samples on samples and samples and have fittings and fittings and fittings. And then after all of that, he'll be like, no, I don't really like it. And then he'll have to start again. And in the New York Times article, they interviewed Zach Posen, who of course was a massive designer, works with some of the biggest fast fashion brands and, you know, companies like Target. And Zach Posen said that most times when you work with these kind of companies, there's a 2-to-1 ratio, which means that for every 2 samples you made, there's most likely going to be 1 that actually goes into production. And he said that sometimes it's rare, but you might see like a 3-to-1 or a 4-to-1 ratio if like someone's really fussy or if they're really okay with experimentation. But in Kanye West's example, it's way over 4-to-1 ratio. He's like making loads of samples and not using it. So eventually, Gap needed a solution. They needed something that will not cost them so much money in the sampling process and just like wasting money doing all this sampling and product testing, all to no avail. And so it makes complete sense that Kanye West reached out to Demna to help with the sampling process of what he wants to create at Gap. And that's why now you have this whole phrase that they coined, which is Yeezy Gap engineered by Balenciaga, because Balenciaga is not exactly producing the garments. Where Balenciaga comes in is in the sampling process. So once Kanye West brought Demna on board onto the whole Yeezy Gap project, what then happened was Kanye West now started using the Balenciaga ateliers to make the samples in collaboration with Demna. So Kanye West would send his ideas to Demna and send pictures, and they would WhatsApp each other, and Demna would work with the ateliers and sort of create these samples that would then be sent to Kanye West for his approval. And this is how things started going. And this is why now, after so long, they finally had their first like actual collection under Yeezy Gap after how many years. And it's mainly because him working with Demna and now having the samples at Balenciaga, which is a level of sophistication that Kanye West is used to working with. Oh, now we can do things quicker. And actually, to quote what Demna Gvasalia said in this New York Times article, he said, Ye called me in March 2021 telling me he was working on this project and it was a dream for me to work together with him on it. He said this is what he needs there. To bring this know-how to the brand, bring the structure, fittings, atelier, pattern maker. The way they were doing things was more trying them on and styling rather than constructing. And of course, we are starting to see the outcome of this Yeezy Gap engineered by Balenciaga. Of course, we've seen everywhere now that they had this release in like New York stores and everything was in sacks, and the reason why it was like that was they really wanted you to rummage through the clothing and try your size, and it was this idea of like touching clothing and really trying it on and interacting with clothing. And this is especially important for Gap because of the pandemic. They haven't had any in-person Yeezy Gap drops until now. Everything was online, whether it's the hoodies or the round jacket, for example. So that is essentially the story of, you know, Yeezy Gap engineered by Balenciaga. And really read this New York Times article. It's really good because they interviewed Demna himself and like interviewed everyone. So because they have that sort of access, so we got all the information all in one article essentially. But in the article, Demna also talks about how so this whole Yeezy Gap engineered by Balenciaga, it's only for now, and like Balenciaga's involvement in Yeezy Gap is like done. All it was to sort of help Kanye West get to where he was going. So in the future, we might see Yeezy Gap engineered by Gucci next, who knows, or Louis Vuitton, we don't know, which is quite interesting. And they also talk in the article about how they created like a Gap innovation lab in LA, which is supposed to be more sophisticated than the normal Gap places, and they've hired people there that think more creatively. And yeah, I just think they need to continue trying to build a framework where Kanye West can sort of create what he needs to create. And this is why I think Kanye West has saved Gap. I remember reading articles when those hoodies dropped and they broke all the Gap website records. Like they sold out the quickest in Gap's history. They made the most from one single product, the quickest that they've ever made in like Gap's history. So he was breaking so many financial records. They made so much money from the Yeezy Gap drops. So clearly it's working. I think the issue with the Yeezy Gap business model, and why I do think that Yeezy ultimately will save Gap, but I think that there's things that they need to fix, otherwise it won't work. And one of the things is creating more product. If Kanye West is taking years to make all these samples and he can't release any product, Gap is not like Balenciaga that can take things slower than a fast fashion brand. That's not the business model. The whole business wasn't created to accommodate that. And so therefore, he needs to create more products. And the way he can create more product is they need to build a framework where he feels sort of in a way that he can let go a bit and the sampling process can be faster. I think why the engineered by Balenciaga worked is because he trusts Demna. So Demna might have some ideas that he might not necessarily agree with, but just because it's Demna, he might be like, oh, okay, yeah, it's cool. And that's why things go faster. So until that sort of framework is built, I don't see how the whole Yeezy Gap thing is worthwhile, because they're trying to make $1 billion in a year. You don't make $1 billion in a year by releasing one product. The reason why the whole Yeezy Adidas thing made so much money is because they made so think of how many Yeezy drops there were. Loads. Like literally every month there was a Yeezy drop. So yeah, they need to sort that whole situation out. Then also, Kanye West as an individual is as much a liability as he is an asset. For all the good things he brings creatively, he just has these moments where he just goes off. Like he has these moments where he just starts talking rubbish. And part of it is because obviously he has some mental health issues, and it's that. And so there's just times where Kanye West can just do insane things or crazy things that might affect his association with Gap and might affect ultimately sales and the stock of Gap. So there's that they have to deal with. And yeah, apart from that, there are just so many other overheads. Like Kanye West is just used to working in a different way to how Gap work. And because to accommodate Kanye West, they're going to, just like this innovation center that they've basically created just because of Kanye West, there's probably going to be so many more things that they have to change about their business model and create and build to accommodate this Yeezy Gap thing. And it's a huge investment that they're making. And if it doesn't bring in dividends, this could really take Gap from, you know, dying to really seriously plummeting. And the last point I also wanted to make about how well Kanye West is going to do with this Yeezy Gap thing is, I remember when it was first announced that he was making Yeezy Gap, he said that his goal for Yeezy Gap was to create like accessible basics to a mass market. Now, the price point of Yeezy Gap, while it's not like super expensive, it's also not super cheap. There are like $200, $300 hoodies. Like, that's not necessarily cheap. That's not accessible. There's not many people can afford like $300 on a hoodie, literally. Like, that's not really that accessible of a price. So they need to work on the price. But I can imagine, because I don't know the specifics of the finances, because this information is not public, but I wonder how much it cost Gap as a company to involve Balenciaga in like the sampling process. I wonder if that cost them loads of money, or if Demna used Balenciaga and sort of did it as a favor to Kanye West, because Kanye West has done so much on behalf of Balenciaga. He's literally a muse for Balenciaga at this point. Kim Kardashian's in all the campaigns, and she's also been a muse, and she's always wearing the Balenciaga outfits, and it's one of the reasons why Balenciaga's always talked about. So I wonder if it cost them loads of money, because Demna and Kanye West actually have that relationship. But now if we have like Yeezy Gap engineered by Gucci, that relationship isn't there. So now it just becomes a business transaction, and it might cost Gap a lot of money, which is going back to my earlier point, why they need to create this framework for Kanye West to do what he needs to do. And so all in all, just from the things that Yeezy Gap has released so far, it's doing well financially. Yes, they need to work on a price point. Even just the fact that Yeezy Gap is on Balenciaga's website shows that it's not an accessible price point. But apart from that, they're doing well. The things are selling. And I think if what I discussed gets sorted, I think that Kanye West and this thing that they've started with Balenciaga will literally save Gap. But let me know what you think. Let me know if you think Yeezy Gap will ultimately save Gap. And I'll be back with another video very soon. Leave your thoughts down below.